Hello there and welcome. So, one of the things I wanted to do in this video today is I'm going to do a review of an old training video from 1959 of Parker and Chuck Sullivan. Now, one of the things I love about the internet, or the age of the internet these days, is we have a lot of material that we never had before, which is phenomenal. That is just excellent to be able to look back and see what is existing out there, see what was done back in the day. Because a lot of it's written, and let's be clear, like what was written is great, but there are definitely mistakes in it. And I find that constantly when I look at breakdowns of techniques, the way they're written. You end up playing a game of Twister sometimes if you try to do the technique the way it is actually written in some journals or some resources that we have available. The reason I find this interesting as well is looking back on these videos, we see variations of how things were done by Parker himself, which is really interesting. So, we had a good discussion recently on locking horns, for example, over on Facebook when I posted it there. My locking horns video, for example, I taught with the way I've done it for years, which is with an inward elbow. It finishes with an inward elbow, or at least that's the way I teach it and the way I've shown it. Then someone came back and had said, actually, it's written in the 32 technique syllabus as an inward diagonal elbow or an inward downward diagonal, whatever you want to call it. Give it as many names as you want. But it was traveling or traversing a diagonal line, and that was the way it was always written. Then when I looked at the Kenpo journal, which was Rich Hale's conglomeration of notes and other things, belonged to Parker at the time, that's where it was written as an inward elbow as well, or a horizontal and inward elbow. So there's a few different variations out there. And then you have something like Dojo Television, for example, which has popped up recently. And there's a video of Parker doing locking horns ending with a horizontal elbow. So the variation is there. And as I've said in previous, voiceovers that I've done and other things like that, it depended on the time that you got Parker, or what mood he was in, or what he was teaching at, or who he was teaching at one point in time. So again, it depended. There were variations. Yes, they were written a certain way, but there are documents where it's written differently. And that's one of the things that's out there. So in the 1959 version, which was Parker and I believe Chuck Sullivan, who I had the pleasure of meeting as well. So in 1959, that is the version that initially Parker was working on at that stage with the likes of Sullivan and so on at BYU at that phase, or in and around that time. So it's maybe the first version of Kenpo, if you want to call it, per Parker as well. Obviously, what they had at that stage was taken directly from Chow, and that was the versions that we had at that stage. So again, there's a lot there that we can look at and see, and you can see a lot of techniques were done very similarly, and you can see a lot of techniques that were done very differently. So that's what we're going to look at today. This tape obviously comes from another channel, so I will post a link to that channel as well in the description. So please do make sure subscribe, do all that wonderful stuff for that person as well who runs that channel. I don't want to be the one to say that this is my material and this is where I've gotten it from, so we'll reference out to people as well from there. But do check that out. Do have a look as well. But again, this is from 1959. It is one of what I have seen four tapes. So we will look at the four tapes as we go along, and we'll break them down as we go individually. For this one, we're going to do tape one. So I'm going to jump over to my video share. And the video kicks off with Parker doing the basics, the basic blocks, the basic strikes, for example, and basic kicks. So here you have your standards, your outward extended, your short outward, your upward block, your downward block. And there are the three variations of downward block here as well, as we can see. So you've got all of the three plus the push down blocks, which show up in short one. Now, on this as well, there obviously those blocks are right there from the start, and we've had that discussion, or I've had that discussion on some of my videos about the inverted downward block, the last of the downward blocks that he did there, not actually being included in any techniques anymore because it was part of intellectual departure, which no longer exists in the system, or at least not in the formal curriculum, but a lot of people still do it, as we say, because it covers that lower third quadrant, where most of our techniques address the outward downward block as well. So again, that's in here right from the start. Today, we isolate those out They are done in long form 1 at the very end as moves in isolation, and they are done in long form 2 as moves in movement towards the end of that form as well. But again, it's interesting to call out that those things existed here and would have continued on for a long time as part of the basics as well, and do still exist as listed basics in many, many different spaces at the moment. So here what we have is the chamber positions that he's showing. So you have the dead hand for the likes of Dance of Death, you have the mid line, and then you'll have the high line like Flashing Mace, for example, just here. So here he's demonstrating, and as we can see, you have your Dance of Death, you have your Thundering Hammer, and you have your sleeper line here as well. Then you have your chamber position for attacking Mace, for example, or Flashing Wings, and then you have your high line. Now, the interesting one here is the low line strike and the high line strike. We don't typically see the low line strike done in that way. We do see Flashing Mace obviously having that high line. Here we have Mr. Sullivan doing the 3 basic kicks from both sides. So you've got your front, your side kick, and your rear kick. And then he'll demonstrate those as well. So off of a short outward block, you have your long kick from the rear and the front. And then you have your outward extended with your side kick from here. Then he has his inward to his back kick, which in some ways would have set up at one point intellectual departure. Obviously not on the high line, but on the low line. But might also be where aggressive twins, for example, which would have been one of the other techniques that was removed, the other 3, the third being spreading branch. Again, it might have been a progenitor to that. So those techniques may have started back here, or probably did start back here, and then obviously were removed later on or split out into different components as we go along. So potentially could be setting that up too. Here we get into the techniques, and there are a few techniques. There are 12, I think, in most cases, 11 to 12, depending on the videos that we see here as well. So again, technique 1, interestingly, is lone kimono. It is against the grab. So if you look at it, we today obviously have our first technique ever being delayed sword, which is typically against a grab. And as I've said in my video there, that's the least severe type of attack that someone will deal with. So it's a left hand lapel grab in delayed sword, whereas lone kimono we know, it's a right hand lapel grab actually in delayed sword. I correct myself. But in lone kimono, it is against a left hand lapel grab in this case. So here, the technique is very much the same as what we would expect it to be. You have your hyperextension or break into your inward block, as we can see. And then you have your chop. In this case, it goes to the throat, but in later videos, again, at varying times, you would see Parker hit to the philtrum, just under the nose, for example, here. So again, target selection, what ifs, whatever it may be, but lone kimono was there from the start. We then, of course, have crossing talon. Now, the interesting one on crossing talon here, which we'll just step back ever so slightly, is the hand configuration. So whereas in my video of crossing talon, for example, we would show the check going this way. I haven't actually released that video yet, I don't think. But again, you would have your check going over the top. You would be moving over the wrist and re-grabbing. Or in some cases, as we've seen, you would have a check on the hand and you would have a Nikio style move from Aikido. You would then trace that into an elbow on the back of their elbow, like a wakigatami style lock from Japanese systems. You would have all manner of different things there as well. So again, here what we're looking at is the very basic version, which is grab the inside of that wrist. There's no overpowering. There's no fighting a stronger person. There's no nothing at this point. It is literally grab the thing that is grabbing you and, do something to follow up with that. Here again, crossing talon in this case is very much an inward block or a smash on the elbow, as we already have, an elbow to the head, and then we have an elbow to the spine. So it's a much shorter technique at this point as well. It doesn't have the elbow to claw to pull elbow to dropping elbow to knee and so on. Technique 3 here is grip of death. So again, our headlock into our double hammers, one to the groin, one to the kidney, which can't be seen here. And then you also have the pullback and the palm strike at this stage. So one of the things in this one that I want to also call out is if we take a step back here, we would basically have a position. The legs, as you notice here, for example, there's no pin on the leg at the lower line. And that's the way this technique is written, as I've said in my own videos as well. It's usually that you're being pulled forward so hard and so fast that you have to step forward and literally stop your balance from being taken too much. You stop yourself by stepping forward on the right leg. You do a hammer to neutralize any downward force on you as well, or continue the downward force on you. So there is no pin on this, as you can see back then in 1959, and I'm using that date because that's the date I've seen put on these. It may have been earlier, maybe in slightly later into the 60s, who knows, or in the early 60s rather. But again, the step here is different. Sometimes, if you look at things like the grasp of death, for example, which obviously came later, or grip of death, some people do pin the leg. Typically speaking, the pin on the leg maybe might come on the neck compression here, where you pull back and then you hit your palm strike. But again, at that point, the initial step doesn't have it back then. So number four in this case is an interesting one because, again, as you see here, it is a rear bear hug arms pinned. Okay, and with that bear hug arms pinned, we're stepping out to the right in this case with a left hammer strike to the groin. As the technique continues, however, so it looks like crushing hammer at the initial outset, except it's stepping on the opposite direction, where crushing hammer steps out to the left with a right hammer strike in today's era. Back then, obviously, we're stepping out to the right and hammering with the left. What you'll notice here is as he steps behind the leg, he does his outward elbow and his hammer strike here. So we've got an amalgam here of crushing hammer and crashing wings. So you'll notice that the technique obviously is done against the arms pinned, as I said, but it is not, typically what we would recognize as crashing wings today. The last two elements of that technique are part of crashing wings today, but without the crashing elbows or crashing wings in this case. So it's interesting to see where the technique potentially housed a lot of materials and then was split out to answer another question. In this case, obviously, crushing hammer today addresses the arms pinned from the rear. In that case there, or in today's case again, crashing wings addresses the rear bear hug arms free. And that's why we take our step out, and that's why we do what we have there as well. So again, it's interesting to see the amalgam here and how that would have eventually evolved, real use of the word evolution there, or evolved in this case, into different techniques, to different solutions, to different answer or different questions. So again, something interesting to see in this video. Number five then is thundering hammers. So here we have a very definite thundering hammers, but you'll notice it's very traditional by comparison. Very clearly a neutral stance, very clearly a forward bow with that stomach strike, or midsection strike. You have the hammer to the kidney happening and rotating back. There is an implied leg check there, but it's not as implied as it would be today, or explicit as it would be today. So again, you see it there, the stance barely shifts in terms of attacking the leg, but certainly is there in terms of all the rotation into the different moves, neutral to forward bow, to neutral to forward bow, etc., etc. So again, interesting to see that there. And again, one of the techniques that is the base of a lot of what we do and set up as the base of a lot of what we do. That between Dance of Death, Thundering Hammer, and Sleeper, they'd be three related techniques, as we saw earlier in the basics, that you would have the three height levels for that incoming strike or inside strike as we go, following, an inward block, for example. So again, good to see that one there. Here then we have, and I don't have my swear jar handy, 5 count, 5 swords, whatever it became eventually as time went on. You have your inward block to your chop, and then you have your palm strike here. And the difference on this one is can't really be made out very easily, but it is a spear hand to the midsection as opposed to the uppercut. Now, interestingly, that would be a lot more like what we do at the start of long two, for example. So long form two, we have our block, we have our chop, we have our palm strike or poke in this case, and then we have our mid strike, again, mid-level strike with the fingers as well. So very similar to that, where that would have fit into long form two at the time, or today's forms, as it were. There, obviously, there was a discussion again when I put 5 swords up. I do it with the double chop, as I said, and I made my jokes about 5 counts, or five hammers and a chop or whatever it may be. But here there was a discussion around that with Tom Bleecker, who actually stepped in. Tom Bleecker, a very senior, long-standing Hempo person, wrote the journey and so on, which I was really pleased to see. He stepped in and he was saying that, for example, and I'm paraphrasing here, there was a flaw in that Bruce Lee had actually pointed out to Parker as they were going through that technique one night, and that is about crossing the center line to address it and leaving yourself wide open. Whereas Wing Chun would have gone straight in down the middle, for example, or attack the center line. We crossed the center line for that one, and that was a flaw that was built in. So it's interesting to see those types of information coming out based on this. Whereas back in the day, it was done very clearly, as it was shown here, and then it's again evolved over time through lessons, through interactions with others, testing, whatever you want to call it, to what we have today, or the variations that we have today as well. So that's a really interesting one to look at. Technique number 7 then is a very interesting one to me, because it is the start, as you can see, of not so much raining claw, because that's against a right uppercut. Glancing wing, as we know, is against the left uppercut with the right block. But what we also get here is we're stepping forward. So we're not stepping back like raining claw does. Glancing wing steps forward, as we know, on this side. But what we're also getting here is, while glancing wing has a lot more in there before we get to this inward elbow, what actually happens here is we get more of what mace of aggression will eventually become in yellow belt, where we have the inward to outward elbow, as we'll see here. So there's our block down, and there's our inward elbow to our outward elbow in this case. So again, you've got two technique concepts, and you can see where, for example, glancing wing, with the addition of the left hand movements, that punch to the face, the clear on the hand, the uppercut with the right hand into the glancing wing, that would have evolved over time into that. And you can see that relationship there between mace of aggression and glancing wing in its own right, when you look at it in this context. So again, it's interesting to see how that would have worked. What I do note around a lot of these, and I'll save some thoughts for later on, is it's very traditional by comparison. It is very one-handed, one-sided, whereas obviously modern Parker Kenpo uses the left hand, the checking hand, a lot more. So again, there's a lot more flow between the limbs in what we do today to fill that space, to capitalize on using both hands and both sides of the body effectively, as opposed to the more traditional idea of the left hand as chambering, which does bring strength to the front hand, but doesn't necessarily work in the same way that we would today, where the hands are constantly flowing, striking, checking, etc. So it's an interesting thing to look at here as well as we go through this. The techniques are, or seem to me, to be of that very traditional ilk, as they were back then. Technique number 8 then is, I would say, a progenitor to thrusting salute. We have our step back with our downward block, as we can see. You have a kick, which is slightly higher than the groin, and you have a punch to the face. Whereas, obviously, thrusting salute for us would be a kick to the groin with a palm strike to the face. So the timing is different on that one as well, with the follow-up strike, which is interesting. And the fact that it comes back again, it doesn't proceed forward, as we do in thrusting salute. So again, there's the basis of a technique here, and obviously that to me is very traditional. That looks very karate-esque by comparison to what we do today in some ways. So again, interesting little things that we see. You can see the very much wholesale lifted and shifted techniques that we have today that have changed very little by comparison. And you have the ones that have been altered very significantly, due to timing, the application of the equation formula potentially, all of these different things as we go along. Here we have our ground technique, which is encounter with danger. The only difference here is it is two kicks. It is a side kick after you've hit the floor, and a roundhouse to the head. Whereas, or potentially a side kick to the head as well, depending on the position. Hard to see here. Again, in our current technique, there is a third kick in there, which is the mule off the left leg to get yourself up and out from that position and off the ground as a recovery move as well in some cases. So again, that was there from the start. There's a lot in there. There's a lot of material that we've already done, and that we still continue to do to this day as well. So interesting to see these things. And that one definitely shows up as well, Encounter with Danger, in the Sophisticated Basics of Kenpo series, volume 1 and 2, that Parker also put out just before the end of his life as well. So it's interesting to see what has carried over in a lot of ways and what has been added to it. This one here in particular is unusual to me. It's an outward block, obviously, with a rear kick and a front kick. Those of us who have Sword of Destruction, or if you've seen my video on Sword of Destruction, it follows the delayed sword method, which is closest target, closest weapon, or closest weapon, closest target. So in that case, we would typically do our outward extended block, we would do our kick off the front, and then we would have our hand sword from there. Even if you look at techniques like snaking talon, for example, we kick off the front leg and then we kick with the back leg. As we turn and we do our mule kick in that one. For begging hands, for example, we step back, we kick with the lead leg, then we kick with the follow up leg. For checking or for calming the storm, sorry, not calming the storm, circling. Oh my god, my apologies. For charging ram, we would typically step off, and we would then have our rear leg, or front leg again, kicking to the stomach, with the rear leg kicking to the head. Then, so this is interesting as it really shows the back to front or rear to front chicken kick, as opposed to the front to rear chicken kick, which we typically use more often in our techniques today. So there ended essentially what I wanted to look at today. And the interesting thing about all of this is, if we look at what was there, a lot of it has come wholesale, exactly as it was back in the day. We can see where certain things were split out, as I gave that example earlier on of crushing hammer, crashing wings, that amalgam technique. Now, again, I don't think any of these techniques had names. As you can see, they're technique 1, 2, and 3, which is interesting because here in Ireland, a lot of the what was termed traditional Kenpo had numbered techniques. Against the straight punch, for example, 24 straight punch techniques, whatever it was at those times. So they hadn't really got names in the initial phase. And then as the modern system came about, the modern Kenpo, as it was known, came in, the names start getting added as time went on and so on. And that's where we got to the system of Parker Kenpo that we've got today, where we've got all wonderful flourishy names and everything else like that. But again, looking back at that time, you can see the groundwork that is already there. There are a lot of traditional elements, or more traditional applications that I see in this. And again, like I've said, things like, introducing the checking hand, low line strikes with the knees for thundering hammers, for example, are a lot less pronounced here, but they certainly do show up, later on in interpretations and additional evolutions as time went on. So again, it's interesting to see where the more traditional aspect of it is popping up. And I do think as well, that was down to some of the stuff with Chow, for example. This was at a period where Parker was still, as far as I'm aware, and historians, please check me on this one. But again, Parker was still involved with Chow. He was still kind of back and forth, and likewise, Chow's philosophy, as I've heard it attributed to him, was if you're doing any more than 3 moves, you're losing. And if you look at a lot of these techniques, lone kimono, thundering hammers, any of these, they are very short techniques. There's a lot in them in terms of where we could overlay our principles and concepts from today. But again, they're very short, very to the point techniques in these cases as well, which is interesting. And I think that was the influence, that where it had just come from what Chow had taught Parker, and then where Parker was starting to play around with his own stuff as the time went on or time progressed. Now, there are 4 of these tapes, as I mentioned earlier on, and I will absolutely look at those as well. So if you did enjoy this little foray into the past, comparison, my own review, my own notes of what I know about Kenpo, and that again is a very loaded term these days. But again, from my practitioner Kenpo, or practice of Kenpo over the years, things I've picked up, things I've learned, things I've seen, the variations that creep in, where Parker didn't do it right at that way, but yet he did it in certain videos in other ways. We can go down that road forever. What I love looking back at is and say, here's the root of what we did. Here's how it has changed. Here's where elements of it has been used to make what we have today. Or here's what we've literally kept wholesale. And those potentially will be, as we said, comparable to the list of master key techniques that we have had bandied around forever as well. Lone kimono, first technique shown here on these tapes back in the day. It's a left-hand lapel grab. It follows the logic, not necessarily this following the logic that Parker's one would have followed, but again, or does follow today. But it was a grab. It was the first thing you probably learned to defend against, was someone grabbing you. The fact that they grab you with the left is it's their lead hand in most cases, and it was probably following with a punch. Hence why we did it. Then, as we said, we had delayed sword being the right hand, and we were on the inside of the body. So again, the opposite, or the the other side of that technique, the what if he grabs you with the right instead of doing lone kimono on the same side with your left hand, which is weaker, you would use your right hand to do an inward block because you're on the inside, use your kick, use your chop. Or again, knowing history, you had delayed sword, Chinese sword being the Tracy system where it was block, chop, you know. So again, these variations are all there, these things exist. It's interesting to look at these things for that reason and see where we started and how we did it. And also to see that they were doing some of the stuff we do back then. We've just layered it in different ways, or we've got different concepts and principles, and a whole encyclopedia and dictionary put around Kenpo that Parker developed over the next 40 years at this stage, or 30 odd years at this stage. So there's a lot in there, there's a lot to be looked at. And I'm happy to take that journey because I do enjoy this element of what we do as well. So, on that note, if you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. Please make sure you do share it as well. Maybe in the comments here, we can have more discussions, or you can add your own thoughts to it as well as time goes on. Certainly a historical document, I feel, and I will share the link, as I said, to the channel or the original videos as well that they belong on. Thank you to that person for also putting that up and making it available to us all. It's really interesting and really good to see. So that's it. That's all I've got for now. See you in the next one.